not all experiences result in trauma, even if can be categorized as traumatic experiences. But it is to the degree or the ability of the nervous system to deal with the information, because all this is information. It is the ability of the processing power of our nervous system to assimilate and integrate all these into the fabric of our awareness. This is a short, simple question on spiritual bypassing, comes from Doris. I have been on a spiritual quest for decades. I have had spontaneous movements for many years and lately vocalizations. They have gotten more intense as of late. Question: can early childhood pain and trauma be healed and released through the Kriya process? I don't want to spiritually bypass the emotional realm, and it seems to take energy and attention away from spiritual development and awakening. First of all, the clarification with regard to Kriyas, for those who will be watching this, and let's say those who are not fully versed and aware of our particular work, what we call Kriyas. We refer to Kriyas only with regard to the involuntary movements, physical, emotional, psychological, all the range of these involuntary movements called Kriyas in our work. And this is not the same as physical, let's say, movements performed consciously, as in the case with Kriya Yoga or Kundalini Yoga, all these spiritual organizations and movements have identified their own language and their own methodologies, and it's also known as Kriyas in their work. But in our work, reference to Kriyas are always with regard to involuntarily, in other words, spontaneous movements, which has nothing to do with consciously doing something. So, and now my answer would be that yes, all traumas, childhood or otherwise, can be indeed healed through the process of Kriyas. And I would like to point out to the confirmation of that to some of the peers in the field who have been creating the possibility for inducing these Kriyas, these involuntary movements, because they believed there is a strong understanding, there's a whole body of work that deals with somatic and psychosomatic relationship, of how body accumulates and stores all this unprocessed information. That's what traumas are. Stresses and traumas differ only in terms of the intensity. One can accumulate stress from a particular stressful day, but one would shake off that stress given one is engaged in some form of conscious activity where it is known for release of these accumulated stresses into the nervous system by freeing it by virtue of, let's say, well, the number one, both thumbs up, meditation. Meditation is one of the most proven clinically and otherwise classically, historically, traditionally, way of freeing the system from the accumulated stresses. Then there are other activities that are accompanied by, let's say, increased chance and possibility for going into flow states. One can release straight when one, let's say, is given to certain deliberate physical activity like dancing or even jogging or swimming. Anything that it has one way or another brings the possibility for going into that state of associated with where nervous system one way or another falls onto the possibility that, let's say, when you jog, when you run, at some point you enter that state of trance. And the same could happen in the dancing, in the swimming, playing musical instrument, singing, being engaged in the activity where it would be accompanied by the release of stress. Trauma is the same thing, but just much more deeper seated. Traumas are unreleased stresses that calcify and accumulate in the system to such degree that then they are referred to and spoken of as deep-seated traumas. So we know that Peter Levin, for example, who have emphasized the importance of the bodily movements. In his work, in particular, these conditions were provided where the patients would be subjected to some kind of active possibility for body begin to vibrate, shake. And in the cases where there's an increased pranic activity, this is facilitated by the greater movement of prana, as in our work, our live programs and immersions are simply known for that. But we know that a lot of people today display these involuntary movements. And this can clearly be seen as internal attempts by the nervous system to shake itself off from the accumulated stress. So, of course, this is the kind of, let's say, the obvious blanket-like answer, but then it goes into necessary intricacies in terms of how one can consciously work with the Kriya process so as to not to get arrested at that level where that became the goal or the means to its own end, or end to its own means, whichever way, what is the right way of putting it. So in other words, that shaking oneself off the stresses should ideally be seen as a byproduct of spiritual unfoldment rather than goal in itself. But therapeutically speaking, it does have that value, and everyone will benefit from greater pranic activity. I'm not talking about deliberate awakening of Kundalini. We dealt with that in our online gathering, online darshan, entitled Redefining Kundalini Process, where we have spoken about the distinction between the process known in Sanskrit as pranadhana and Kundalini, because they are almost identical in terms of its display. But the actual impact and the outcome is vastly different. We will definitely release and share that as a separate question and answer video on our channel. So please look it up. But just to confirm that spiritual bypassing can indeed happen if we somehow feel or believe or think that it doesn't matter what have happened to our system if we're carrying certain stresses, certain accumulated, let's say, unprocessed information, because all this, again, to reiterate it, what I have said earlier, that why does it become a stress? And how can trauma be formed? Are all experiences that are, let's say, dramatic or traumatic result in the accumulation of trauma? Well, the bizarre answer to that is no. Not all experiences result in trauma, even if can be categorized as traumatic experiences. but it is to the degree or the ability of the nervous system to deal with the information, because all this is information. It is the ability of the processing power of our nervous system to assimilate and integrate all these into the fabric of our awareness. So whatever cannot be integrated will leave residue as stress, and with time can accumulate in conglomerate of these stresses. This is what the state of psychosis, usually it's a gradual accumulation of unresolved information which results in state of dysfunction. So the energy and attention is always on the understanding of who we are and what we are, in essence. But the accompanying and byproduct of that true awakening should not be dismissed, overseen, or considered irrelevant. Particularly, there are these tendencies among people who have more that intellectual knack, or prefer to have that intellectual grasp of everything, that somehow whatever happened and stored at the level of the body is irrelevant. Sooner or later, it will rear its ugly face and would have to be dealt with. So that, by definition, is what spiritual bypassing. When certain psychic experiences, psychic states, psychological impositions would have to be faced. These may present themselves in form of blind spots that would have to be acknowledged and reintegrated again into the fabric of our consciousness.